I talked to God about 6 years ago and I said, look, you take care of the money, I'm going to take care of the customer.
I grab a fistful, yeah, those are bored heads. Rub upside down, twist the wicked game.
We actually were riding bikes and nobody was doing anything or fixing anything, or you couldn't find any parts, and if you did, why, most of the time it was too expensive. And I remember that we started doing a certain little bit of things and working on bikes. When I lived on 45th and Pearl, I had a shop, and we worked on quite a few things there. My dad was a first-class machinist in the Navy Yard, and I believe the U.S. of America is based on the son being better than his father, all through history. I remember there was a time when I thought a motorcycle wrecking yard was the answer to the world problems, and that's when I started the one that I had in Fife. It worked out well. I hired a lot of young people, and it was really a nice business and everything. I had the state come in because they didn't even know where the numbers were on motorcycles. I worked with them. I worked with the big cop at Fife. I worked with all the way down the line. But it wasn't what I wanted to do, because I found that I had never even noticed it when I thought about all this. All the bikes that you buy are all wrecked in the front end, and all the bikes that people that come in are all wanting to buy parts for the front end. So I put the tool and die that I learned at Boeing to work, fixing all of them, front ends, whether it be the, with this and that. But I also noticed that the biggest problem with the dirt bikes is the wheels on the rear just come apart. I finally talked to somebody, and I don't even know who now, but he said, you know what, if you could go down and apply for a not just a license for that location, because they probably won't give you one. So I did. I went down to County City building and looked this guy and that guy, and the lady said, you want to talk to him, not him. I kind of went, oh, okay, so asked him if there was some way that, and he said, yes, there is. There's a permit in Pierce County that you can make up to 25% of your income as a hobby. And they call it a hobby permit. And you collect taxes, you buy things wholesale from other places wherever necessary. And I worked out of my garage. I built a longer garage and, whatever. At that time, my daughter was just a little teeny thing, and when I was working around the place there, sometimes she'd get in my way, and I got a couple of pictures of running her off, pounding on her bottom with newspaper to make her do what I wanted her to do. But nevertheless, we decided to try and take a little vacation, and we went down into California, and lo and behold, I thought I found what was, the answer to the world problems. I found a motorcycle wrecking yard down there. Well, it just so impressed me that when I came back up, I started the process of trying to get the licenses for it. Well, the first thing I ran into that was pretty interesting, you had to have a license to have a insurance. You had to have insurance to have a license in the wrecking business, because nobody knew anything. Well, I finally found a guy that said he could do everything. So then I started looking around, and the city of Tacoma, every time I go up the County City building, they turn me down, not zoned right. There was a young fellow working there that drove back and forth to Boeing with me for a couple of years, and he said, Morrie, you're never going to get in here in the city of Tacoma. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, there are some people that don't want you in here, do not want a wrecking yard here in Tacoma. And for the life of me, I couldn't think of who it was. At a later date, I realized that it was the Harley people that did not. A couple things happened in the years around there. We stumbled onto them going there to their shop down in the basement. They were doing things that I don't even know what they were, but I think they were all smoking something or other. But nevertheless, I just said, okay, we're not going to have anything to do with it. We'll get out of the city of Tacoma. So who doesn't like Tacoma? Well, Milton, Edgewood, Fife, were a few of them. There was one there down at Point Defiance. We looked down there, but there was nothing there, nothing big enough. I happened to drive by the place in Fife that H&H Diesel was actually rebuilding their trucks in the front yard or out in the street. And so I thought, wow, there was a sign on there that they were closing and moving, and I thought, what a great building. So I found out who owned the building, and it was a fella that owned 5 different florist companies. Gilladucci was the name. So I went to see him, and he told me that they were going to be out of there. And yeah, he said, if you can keep everything inside the building, and you can get permission from Fife, I'll help you remodel. I'll pay for all the costs to remodel and bring it up to standard, satisfy Fife, and then you can open up. So I went around talking to everybody and whatnot, and there was 9 Japanese farms out in Fife at the time, none of the trucker outfits out there. There was the place up on the corner that rebuilds diesel generators, and there's big propellers in front of it. I can't remember the name of it right now, but anyway, when I went to one of the meetings, the Fife City Council meeting, he was there, and he was one of the big wigs, and there was also those 9 different farmers and an interpreter. Everything you'd say would get interpreted to those guys because they couldn't understand English. Well, just before the meeting came, I came down out of Tacoma with my Toyota pickup, and there'd been a little twister had gone right down Pack Highway right through the middle of Fife. And all of the trees, they were all about 30 foot tall, had been twisted and knocked over in the street. And there's one guy standing there with his saw cutting them up, and I stopped and said, "Where's your help?" He said, "I don't have any." I said, "You got to be kidding, you'll be 10 years getting this." He said, "I know, it upsets me." I said, "Well, you know, I don't have anything to do. I got a chainsaw. Could I help?" And he goes, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because I don't have anything to do and I want to show off, I guess." Yeah, so about that time, the cop car pulled up alongside of us here. I said, "Who was you?" And I told him. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to help him cut all these things out here. There's nobody else helping him." He goes, he's a great big guy. He's 6 foot 8 inches tall, 300 and some pounds. So he's intimidating, to say the least. But anyway, he said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "I'll cut him up, let him drag him out, and throw him in the big truck he's got." Well, okay, so he gets in his car and leaves. Anyway, I went and helped. I worked 2 days there, actually, and a little while later, we got a board meeting, and I go to the meeting, and of course, I'm actually trying to get permission to be in the city of Fife in that building. So I'm sitting there, the guy from up above, up the corner with the big propellers and all the generators and stuff for sale, he's there too, and then there's an interpreter and a couple of guys, and they're asking me questions and whatnot, and they're trying to tell me that, you know, they can't have anything happening outside that building. And I explained to them that anything with motorcycles, you have it outside the building, somebody's stealing anyway. So it'll all be inside. Oh, okay. So anyway, we're going along, and about that time the door flies open. Now, I'm serious. It flies open. In walks this cop. He looks all around. He points at me, and he said, "He's a good guy." And he turned around and walked out. Well, now, if you're a little ornamental guy, you know, and you got a little farm out there, and you're having questions of whether you should help me out or not, if the cop that controls the whole area comes in and says he's a good guy, you ain't going to go against him. And so, 100% go. And Gilladucci paid for everything. We remodeled and moved in. And interesting enough, the state of Washington, the state patrol, had no idea where the numbers for most of the motorcycle brands was at on the frame, on the engine. On the frame they knew because they all are on the steering head. But I set up a thing down at the end of the building where they could go in and take pictures of where all of them was. So every time I'd get in something new, a Triumph, a BSA, or a Harley, or an Indian, or whatever, I'd call them and they'd send a guy out and he'd take pictures of where all of the different numbers were on the thing. And actually that was one of the reasons that I made it, because I had the cops kind of wanting to know what I'm involved in, you know. So, excuse me a minute. This is Morrie. How can I help? Yes. Jim, did you see the little valve cover that went on that?
I got it.
One of the interesting things was that I thought I had the world by the tail, but I suddenly one day after about 4 years, well, about 2 years into there, I realized that all the motorcycles that I was buying were wrecked in the front end. And everybody that came in wanted front end parts. And all of a sudden my world come tumbling down because I didn't have anything to supply to them. So what truly kicked in then was my tool and dying out of Boeing kicked in. And I said, well, why don't I fix all those things, then I'll have them. I can buy them, they're practically free, and I'll just straighten them and fix them. So I figured out how to straighten the forks, how to straighten the rake plate, the triple clamp, how to do frame straightening, whatever was needed. And also I bought machines, about 3 of them, to bore cylinders, and most of them were a big joke. Finally ended up buying a Bridgeport milling machine that was in a company over by Puyallup, and the IRS had got them and they were going out of business. So I ended up buying it at an auction, and I started boring out of that. They were very, very accurate, and that kind of got me headed in the right way, because otherwise it wasn't working. Everything you buy was already wrecked, and everything that they wanted was already, was bent up and whatever. So that started all of it. I had an old man that had the Weisco distributorship up in Seattle, Art Yellen. He wanted to get out and retire, so I bought it from him. I think it was $48,000 if I remember, and he figured he was going to have an income for a while, and Glenn and I just got to work, and the next thing we had it paid off in about a year. But it gave me an income from the piston business, because Weisco makes a forged piston, and probably the best that there is. And you have to have a lot of stock, but once you have that, you were in line. And now, today, they plate all the cylinders, so you may have to have a lot of standards, but no oversizes, because there's no boring cylinders, unless you have some of the old stuff. But one of the things that was happening all the time was the wheels, and it wasn't the front end that got wrecked, it was the rear ends that were getting busted, bent, weren't working, falling apart. And I thought, you know what, there must be something that someone can do. I had a boss at Boeing, and at first I didn't like him, but I realized that he had a photographic memory, and he and his math were unbelievable. I asked him, he lived at Midway, I asked him to come down and help me to build or to assemble something that was strong, very strong. He did. We spent a couple of days, and out of it was the simple thing about a handshake. You reach out and take someone's hand. If he was falling off a cliff, I could never hold him. But if he grabbed me above my wrist and I grabbed his wrist, I could hold him. If I didn't, he'd take me with me, and I'm going to work a whole lot harder holding him from falling off that cliff. Now, what the difference, one is we're pulling our hands apart, the other one we're pulling them together. And when you get into looking at that, you all of a sudden realize that's what you got to do to the wheel. And with Jerry's help, my ex-supervisor, we started putting together some math and figured out what we do. Well, after a while, as my son Jim got a little older, he started wanting to do things here, and he was riding bicycles on the BMX field and doing very, very well. And so I said, well, why don't you come in and I'll try to teach you some of the things. You're going to sweep the floors just to get the smell in your nose, and then after that we'll start in. Well, he really just got pulled over those wheels. For some reason, it just seemed like it was fit him. It's like a pair of pants. They fit some people, they don't fit others, and they just fit Jim perfectly. So we started in the process. First you teach him how to do this, and then that, and then that, and then pretty soon you put them all together, and he's building wheels. And at first we just repaired them, so we'd replace a spoke here, replace a spoke there. Truing is another whole thing, and it takes your focus, but you got what they call a finger, and that being a finger, but it's just something sticking out, and you do it to the inside of the rim, so that wherever it's going by that finger, you're looking down, and when it's touching, you got to tighten it tighter towards the center. When it's not touching, you got to let it back off a little. So you tighten here, loosen there. And then once you get it round, then you can move it sideways by using the outside spoke to pull it in and the inside spoke to pull it out. Pretty soon he was kind of carrying his own ball over there, and I started moving bigger and bigger in what I was doing. Also, during that period of time, they started quitting the 2-cycle motorcycle and started building the 4-cycle bike, which is today's bike. And the pistons got way shorter, but bigger around, and they went from 2-valve to 4-valve on a single cylinder. And the camshafts are higher drop and quicker drop and, you know, all kinds of different things. And of course, I had done all that, but you need to kind of catch up with what they're doing so that you know what their thought and their way of doing things. And I started talking to people. There were some automobile places that one of the boys was racing, Waterhouse Motors. We worked on his bike, made things run for him, made him go fast, built him good wheel, whatever. I went to them and talked about what is it that the 4-stroke has that's going to happen, and what is the difference of how they grow newer. Well, one of the things is they do a shorter piston to get the weight down, so they don't have to have the inertia involved in the valve or the piston direction change. And they went all through all that, and most of it went over my head, but I got the idea because I noticed the pistons went from a 4-inch high piston and 2 inches in round to a 1.5-inch wide 2-inch round piston. And the stroke changed to a short stroke and not a long stroke. So what difference is that? Well, the long stroke is for torque. Excuse me. The short stroke is for RPM, because it takes too long to get from there to here to go too fast. So here, fast, fast, fast. This is power. And every stroke on a 2-stroke is a fire, but every stroke is not a fire on a 4-stroke. Every other one. So it has to go up and down, up and down. And it's the second up and down that fires and makes the power. So the faster you can turn that piston around and make it do it the same as it did before, the more RPM, the more power you have. And so we started into that, and I bought all the equipment to cut the seats, to lap them, to there's cutters for the seats that have carbide at different angles. There's 2 or 3 different angles on every valve. Clearance angle, a valve seat angle, and a clearance angle on the inside. And all the seats are harder than heck, so you have a carbide insert, so it cuts it. Then a piece that goes down the valve guide itself to guide and keep it on line. Took a while, but things started coming around, then lapping compound, and I found, actually I think I had that from a car that I did back in the 60s. I bought a crank thing to lap valves, and it actually turns like about 130 degrees, then it backs up about 20 degrees and goes another 130 and backs up 120. And that's how you lap fast. Otherwise it's doing it by hand, which is not very accurate because you're trying to apply pressure down and keep it rolling, where this here you just crank. And I just bought different things where I could get the little suction cup rubbers, and I made a tool to fit them onto this crank, and away we go. Bought a bunch of cutters, and then I bought a bunch of seals and a bunch of valve guides and, you know, all kinds of things, and slowly but surely moved into that era, I might even say. I also began to notice that some of the new tools that are coming out were battery operated, would last indefinite almost. So I started changing from 110 over to a battery on a lot easier, because you'd have to drag it around the shop, unplug and plug there, you know. And I still have a lot of that. I bought a lathe in the meantime. Most of the things we do on the lathe are kind of aftermarket, but you know, if the center spark plug is on the center of the combustion chamber, you can put it on a tool in the chuck and you can spin it and polish on the lathe. If it's not, you have to do it on some kind of a handheld device to polish it off. I don't know, we also bought a few other things. A couple of people beginning to go out of business. There was a welder out on Pacific Avenue or South Tacoma Way. He went out of business. I bought a welding table he had. I bought a bunch of other equipment, big saw, all kinds of stuff, because they were all going out of business because the world has changed so dramatically in the last 20 years it'd blow your mind. And so he was going out, and I had the I knew him well because I was always going out and have something done. I used to do all the welding, actually. I learned how. Both heliarc. I bought a big heliarc machine. It works great. But then I started having some troubles, and the trouble turned out to be heart trouble, and they got a defibrillator in, and of course it is affected by this electricity that's coming out of a welder. So parked all the welding, and I stumbled onto a guy. I'd known him for years, but I didn't ever use him that much. His name is Dick Washer, out on Browns Point. I believe that man could weld anything to anything if he made up his mind to. Working at Boeing, I tell you, on an airplane at 10,000 feet, the welding had to be pretty good, because that first step is a bitch. And he makes those welders at Boeing look like children. He just can do things you can't believe. And so I use him a lot anytime I do any welding. Jim has a friend that welds too, and he does a really nice job, but he isn't Dick Washer, don't by any matter of means. And then, shops around. Woody has a shop in Tacoma, and they had here and there. At one time, my wife worked here with me, and she worked full-time, buying pistons from Weisco back in Ohio, having them shipped out here, stocking them, then taking them off of our stock, putting them in a box, and shipping them to the people who were calling us, because we did have 3 states, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, that were ours as distributors. Well, at one time there was 85 motorcycle shops between the California-Oregon border and through Washington and Idaho-Montana border. 85. Today, I doubt if there's 8 and 5 added together. And it's gone down to practically nothing. There's still a few out there. A lot of them that are still there are working out of their garage because they can't afford the overhead a lot of times. Even the big shop Henshaw's in the valley down here actually closed up finances. Ken Austin, Auburn Motorcycle, closed. Bent Bike, who was the other wrecking yard in the area. He had one in Auburn and one up in above Seattle. Closed and gone. And the reason we're still here is kind of because I read a book written in 1922 by a fella, and it covered life pretty well. And it had a little bit about everything. And one of the things he said, if you ever start your own business, you want to have the property next to your home, and you want to incorporate your home and your property, and yet have a wall between them so they're not infringing on each other. Well, a little while it took me to figure that one out, but I began to realize it's got to do with you being home when your wife wants you and not being there when she doesn't want you. So nevertheless, I started out that way. This was not zoned for a shop for motorcycles or anything, but what it said was that it was zoned for agriculture. And down in the right-hand corner of the information said you could repair anything you want to keep in business. So I went back and showed that to him, and I said, that says that I could have anything here that I could repair to keep me in business. It doesn't say in agriculture, in business. I want to put a building up and do some machine work for different things. And the guy kind of scratched his head, and then he said, well, I see what you're saying, and the literal part of it is just what you're saying, although I don't think that's what they meant. And he looked back and forth and said, I'm going to sign it in anyway, and he did. So I started out with this building. I had it put in by a company up in Linwood. It's a pole building. They did a beautiful job. I had an old man neighbor up here that he came down and took the lumber. There was no barn here. Took the lumber off the barn, stacked it over the side. They built the building. Then he came back and put the second floor with the material that was left over. I bought a little bit, but not much. And then we just started building what is in here. We put a bathroom in. That was a little later, though. but I got the shop in and got it up and running. They gave me a 30 by 30, but they also, down in the left-hand corner in fine print, said I could have motorhome storage. So I said to him, what does that mean? He said, well, you can have an extension on the end of your building to store your motorhome. Well, what is that going to, get into? He said, you got to have a fire door in between. So that's a door on an angle, so if it gets hot, it sets off this thing and it shuts the door. I said, okay. So after I got it all built, they put in that extra room over there. As soon as I got it all bought off and everything, I went over and pulled the slanted off, just pulled a straight door in, and, everybody's happy. Nobody knows the difference. I insulated it really well because I knew I was going to spend most of my days down here and maybe some of my nights. We had concrete floor put in, had somebody from my church come down, 2 of them, and they put the floor in, did a beautiful job. There's a couple little cracks here and there, but they did a great job, and I don't believe there's hardly any steel in it, but it is, a good job done. At a later date, I decided I needed some office room and whatever, so I got a permit for a carport on the north side. I poured the slab. I waited for about 1.5 years, and when I poured that slab, I put in on the corner post steel sockets that hold 4x4s. And then about 1 year later, well, almost 2 years later, I went out there and put 4x4s and built the building. And I looked it up, and it said on the state of Washington, on this property out here, you could have temporary buildings. Well, what's temporary? It means that you tear it down, move it, stand it back up again. So I went ahead and built the whole end. It's 22 feet that way and 30 feet the crossways this way, or 40 feet, across this way. One day I hear a beep beep on my alarm, and I look up at my television thing up there and hear somebody with a clipboard stand out there. So I go out, can I help you? And he said, well, I think this building is a little bit bigger than what your permit goes for. I said, well, no. He said, well, your permit is 40 feet by 30, and he said, well, it looks a little bigger. I said, well, yeah, it is, but that's all temporary. And he said, well, it don't look temporary to me. And I said, well, what's temporary? What it says is, tear it down, move it over here, and put it back up again. Yeah? Come on inside. So he came in, and I showed him even the plasterboard is screwed on rather than nailed on. Because I don't care where the screw heads show. What difference does it make? He kind of laughed and shook his head, and he goes, well, I'll be damned. You kind of got me there. And he said, oh, heck with it. He signed it off. Oh, later on, my car out here sitting in the rain, and I decided to do something about it, so I built a carport full length of the building. Well, it didn't take very long. I come to find out they have satellite pictures of roof sizes, and they recognized my roof was too big, so they sent the same guy out. I go out, he stands there, I go out. He stands there, I know, I see it's all bolted together, so it's temporary. Yep, so that's kind of how I'm here. Now, why am I here and how can I get away with it? I'm here all day long, during the day, and all of my neighbors are gone to work. So they're very vulnerable in this while they're gone. My cameras cover from the corner down here to the corner up there. If anybody does anything, I pick it up on my cameras and do something about it. One day across the street, down on the next street down, right on the edge of it, I heard beep, beep, and I look, and I can camera, and lo and behold, here's 2 guys all on a boat from the back of their house out. I go out, said, hey, I don't think you can do this because you're, unless Dwayne is here. And he said, oh, that's all right. I'm Dwayne's brother-in-law. I said, well, I don't really care who you are. Unless Dwayne is here, you're not going to haul that boat or anything else out from behind your house. And he said, you honestly think you're going to do something about with us 2 guys? And I said, I wouldn't worry about me, buddy. I'd worry about my son standing over there with a rifle on you. That's who the guy I'd worry about. So they went and set the thing down and stomped off, drove off. Sure enough, it was his brother-in-law, but Dwayne came over and said, thank you. Well, I've had other ones where we picked that up. People pull dumb things, That's why they don't argue. We don't make loud noise at night, and they love to have us here because we kind of watch over them, you might say. And if they break something, we can repair it, we do it. We've moved on from just a machine shop that does things because we love the wheels, we moved on and moved on and moved on. I bought upstairs is probably, I'm making a guess, but I'd say 300, 350 rims, either used or new. And we buy from different companies that, you know, manufacture, whether they're steel or aluminum. I ran into a company that actually has their rims made by the large manufacturer. XL makes most of them, but they want so much money, and this company buys them by the hundreds, but they sell them cheaper to a dealer. And I ran into them. We got to know them. And I call them up. I order a minimum of 5. They got them here in 2 days, and they're usually about a third less in cost. Well, that third goes into my pocket, or otherwise I couldn't stay in business because the rims are so high nowadays. So a lot of things today is either anodized or it's powder coated and not chromed. And we stock almost anything you need. If you don't, I have probably 8 different places I can buy them, from Buchanan's in California to SRT in California. There's places back east. I buy, for instance, I used to do crankshafts, the big ones for watercraft, twins and triples. But I found a place in Florida that'll do it for me. They'll ship them back and forth. I don't make quite as much money, but I can make, 25%, and that's enough. I can get by with it. And what I do is I will order it, put it on a cart. It comes in. When I get it, I get the parts from whoever I'm doing it for, and I ship it back in the same box that shipped it in. And the big secret is when you get the money to pay at least a majority on your credit card, that you charge that part, or otherwise you get in trouble. Because if you put all your money in the bank and don't pay it on the credit card, you get yourself in trouble. I've been there. And you have to do it in the will of the Lord. That's the other thing. You got to ask Him before you set the path out. And if that's the right path, He'll tell you, you can feel it, you know it, it's happening. And that's how come we're still here and many, many other shops are not. And Jim and I'll be here long after any of the rest of them ever dream of being here, because of the fact that we do a few things. One is we have property that we own, we don't have rent on, we don't have hardly any overhead. We put out a job that is like we're working for God rather than we're working for money, and we make sure that we take care of the people, and God takes care of that money and gets it to us. We do fine. We make a good living, and we get along great, and that's the other thing. Don't challenge the other person above and beyond, but challenge them to stay in that groove of really the best, and it works. He does it to me, and I do it to him. Anyway, we'll be here long after the others have all gone by the wayside, believe me. Thanks for coming to the Wheelmaster. We started out as Morrie's Wheels, and now it's Morrie Cycle Shop, and then finally the Wheelmaster, because we are the master of the wheel. Either we make them right, or we take the dents out of them and make them round again. Thanks now. Later.
Dude, you are so cool. Your dad is so cool.